Howdy everyone, and today I'm looking at the newest macro lens from Sigma, their new 70mm f2.8 DG Macro Art. It's for full frame and APS-C digital SLR cameras, although as with any lens for digital SLR cameras, you can use an adapter to mount it onto a mirrorless camera. Sigma are also making a special version of this lens for Sony E-mount mirrorless cameras, which is the same optic but with an adapter essentially built in. It costs about $550 in the US and £500 in the UK. For a macro lens that does not feature image stabilization, and this lens does not, that's a little pricey, I feel. 70mm macro lenses have always been fairly popular, as the slightly wider angle of 70mm can still be used quite easily for everyday photography, as well as very close-up pictures, and also the shorter focal length makes them a bit easier to hand-hold. Camera shake is less of an issue at 70mm as opposed to, say, 100mm. It would be a lot easier with image stabilization though, which, as I mentioned, this lens does not feature. The disadvantage of a 70mm macro lens is that you have to get very close to your subject when doing macro photography, which some creepy crawlies don't necessarily appreciate. The lens's maximum aperture of f2.8 is fairly bright. It can give you some nicely out of focus backgrounds in your everyday and macro photography. It wouldn't be my first choice for a portrait lens though. On an APS-C camera, you'll get images that are the full frame equivalent of about 105mm with a much deeper depth of field. Some would argue that that would make your macro photography a lot easier. A crop sensor camera will certainly get you images that look even closer to your subject too. Well, let's look at build quality. The lens feels solid and metallic, and slightly heavy actually, weighing about half a kilogram or just over a pound. It's based on a metal lens mount with a somewhat slim weather sealing gasket around the edge. The lens features controls for auto or manual focus and focus range on the side, and of course there's a large rubberized focus ring. The focus system is fully electronic, focused by wire, and as such it only works when the camera is turned on. It's a bit of a bizarre focus system which I did not get on with. The idea is that with electronic focusing, the ring can turn with far more precision, as you can see here, which is true. But it also takes a long time and a lot of turning for you to get where you want to be. You'll be a bit tired of twisting that focus ring around all day. The autofocus motor is painfully slow and makes some noise. I'm not sure what Sigma were thinking with this autofocus system. I really didn't like it. It does at least work accurately though. The unit comes supplied with quite a deep lens hood, and its front filter size is a small 49mm. Overall, apart from the bizarre autofocus system, the build quality is just fine. Let's take a look at image quality then. Firstly, on a lower resolution full frame camera, my trusty old Canon 6D with its 20MP sensor. Straight from f2.8, resolution and contrast are perfect, superb, from the middle of your images straight into the corners. It stays this sharp down to f11, although f16 is slightly softer due to the effect of diffraction. A perfect performance though. Let's challenge the lens with a much higher resolution full frame camera. I've adapted it here onto my 42MP Sony a7R II. Again, straight from f2.8, the middle of the image is razor sharp, and so are the corners. An astonishing performance. I think this is the sharpest macro lens I've ever tested. It stays this sharp down to f11, and even f16 remains quite good, although just a hint of colour fringing is visible here. Fantastic performance though. And finally, let's try it on a high-resolution APS-C camera by adapting it onto my 24MP Canon EOS M3. Again, picture quality in the middle is perfect, and it's basically perfect in the corners too. There's a tiny improvement if you stop down to f4 though. It stays this sharp down to f11, where a bit of softness from diffraction is making itself felt. Overall, the Sigma 70mm f2.8 macro art is an incredibly sharp optic. No matter what high-resolution camera you stick it onto, it's the sharpest macro lens I have tested so far, quite easily. Okay, now let's take a look at distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera. The lens projects just a hint of barrel distortion, which is barely noticeable at all. What is noticeable at f2.8 is darkness in the corners, although that is reduced at f4 and at f5.6 it's gone. Let's see about close-up image quality, a really important factor for any macro lens. Here is a 50p coin commemorating the liberation of the Falkland Islands, taken at the lens's closest focus distance. In the middle, at f2.8, and in the areas that are actually in focus, you can see that image quality remains razor sharp, even with a 42 megapixel camera. f4 looks a tiny bit cleaner, or maybe that's just a helpful effect of an increased depth of field. Picture quality remains this sharp down to f16, which is noticeably softer due to the effect of diffraction. Another great performance there. Let's see how the lens works against bright lights. Admirably well, actually. There's a little flaring, but that's about it. Finally, bokeh. I found the autofocus backgrounds with this lens to be nice and smooth and undistracting. Maybe not the smoothest I've ever seen, but certainly really nice. Overall then, optically, this new Sigma macro lens is stupendous, one of the sharpest I've ever seen, and with no optical issues whatsoever. It's truly an excellent performing lens, but somewhat spoiled by its awkward autofocus system. Although, I suppose some people might prefer the enormous precision that kind of focus system offers. It's also a shame that, for the money you're paying, you don't get image stabilization. But it's just about the sharpest macro lens on the market today, I reckon. So, on that basis, it has to come recommended.